If you've been along with us for the ride this year, it's our sixth year to host the series, First Wednesdays, and it's now in 9 libraries across the state. The Vermont Humanities Council sponsors it, and we're now actually planning our 2011-2012 season. Our local sponsors are Entergy Vermont, the Brattleboro Savings and Loan, and the main sponsor, the Friends of Brooks Memorial Library. And tonight's program sponsor is the Vermont Department of Libraries. Very pleased tonight to have Dr. Javier Corrales speak to you. He is an associate professor of political science at Amherst College. He obtained his PhD in political science from Harvard. Professor Corrales teaches a course at Amherst College called Cuba, the Politics of Extremism. His research has been published in academic journals such as Comparative Politics, World Development, Political Science Quarterly, International Studies Quarterly, World Policy Journal, Latin American Politics and Society, Journal of Democracy, Latin American Research Review, and other publications. He serves on the editorial board of Latin American Politics and Society and America's Quarterly. He has also been a consultant for the World Bank, the United Nations, Center for Global Development, Freedom House, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is co-author of a forthcoming book, Dragon in the Tropics, Hugo Chavez and the Political Economy of Revolution in Venezuela. Please welcome Dr. Corrales.
Thank you to all of you for coming to the Vermont Humanities Council for the invitation. I wanted to let everyone know that I'm very delighted to be here, and I'm glad it all worked out and there was enough flexibility to accommodate me, and thank you for that. What I thought I would do is, I think originally, way back, I was asked to do a bit of a lecture that discusses Cuba, but from a historical point of view, and I said that that would be terrific. I do that a lot. But I would also like to talk about Cuba, Cuban contemporary politics. So my lecture is going to be divided into 2 parts. In the first part, I want to talk about theories of revolutions and the historical setting that gave rise to this event in Cuba, right at the end of 1958 and throughout 1959. And then we can spend some time talking about Cuba today. Now, Cuba is not in the news. It's been very quiet down in the island for many years now. I'm delighted to see that there is interest nonetheless with so many other trouble spots. The one thing that one could say about Cuba is that Cuba is fairly stable politically, which means very calm, but it also means there is less interest in it. So the fact that I have you guys here is, for me, very impressive, and I thank you for that. I spend a lot of time thinking about Cuba. At some point I would like to, I've written articles in Cuba, and I haven't written a book yet, but that could come at some point. We'll see. I have some ideas. But all right, so with that preamble, let's get started, and let me just give you some background on Cuba to some extent. Cuba is unusual today in that it is an authoritarian regime. In other words, it is a regime that in political science is defined authoritarian because you don't have competitive politics. You cannot have free competition for elected office. Cuba has elections, but Cuba does not have free political parties. The elections occur within the official organs of the state or the official party, and so it doesn't meet the minimum definition of democracy, and it is authoritarian. And what is important to know about that is that in the world today, there is now a scarcity of authoritarian regime. What we have seen is a great number of countries becoming democratic or entering this in-between period that are called hybrid regimes. And here is an illustration going from 1972 to 2009 of an organization that tries to rank countries based on their political freedoms. And they have 3 categories: free countries, democracies; not free countries, autocracies; and partly free. And what we see is that the not free countries have become a small minority, And we have seen a huge expansion of democracy worldwide, as well as an expansion of semi-democratic or semi-authoritarian. Well, Cuba, for most political scientists, easily falls still under the category of not politically free. So that's point number one. Point number two, it is still very Marxist. Now, I know that this is probably going to be a complicated issue because there are many ways of interpreting Marx, but Cuba to this day maintains, except in name, many important policies that during the 20th century were openly embraced by almost all branches of Marxism. Whereas, for example, there were many Marxists who would criticize aspects of Stalin in Russia or Mao in China, the policies that Cuba implemented in the revolution, many of which survive to this day, were never challenged by Marxists worldwide. Maybe Marx might have challenged them, but Marxists, contemporary Marxists, have nothing but praise for the regime, and in part because the policies that they instituted conformed with at least some of the most common denominators of a Marxist theory. And what do I mean by that? Well, in Cuba, there is no property right. Following the precepts of Marxism, the Cuban Revolution was extraordinarily radical because it eliminated the private sector and property rights. When we say property rights are eliminated, we don't mean that private belongings are eliminated. People can own a house or a car, but what you don't have is the right to transact with your property. You cannot sell your car or your possessions to third parties. You have to give it to the state, and then the state decides what to do with it. There is a complete ban on private property historically. And this is something that enemies of capitalism have argued is essential in order to bring the type of equality and good society that Marxism promises. So this to this day exists in Cuba. And so it is authoritarian and it is Marxist. Now, I also want, this is a lot of words, and I don't want you to spend too much time doing this, but this notion of no property rights applies to labor as well. In a capitalist system, people own their own labor. You can decide whom you want to work for or not, freely. In Cuba, you as a worker need to get permission from the state to work wherever it is that you want to work. The state is the sole employer. There's very little, there are no private corporations. You either work for foreigners, and that's a small sector of the economy, or as a self-employed person, but never for another private individual. And this is something that, although relaxed compared to historical experience in Cuba, is the law of the land. Some of the labor codes, for example, there's no collective or individual bargaining. Workers cannot change their jobs without getting permission from the state. Foreign companies, if they hire workers, they cannot hire you directly. The state is the employment agency. So there is a real embargo imposed by the state on capitalism to this day. And some people love it, and some people, of course, find it horrendous. But there's nothing that can be said about the fact that there's no question that we have an autocracy that maintains an important principle of Marxism to this day. Now, I will begin to discuss some issues of Cuba. And I was just reading, not too long ago, somebody who has just published a book on Marx. This is a strong defense of Marx, and in this quote, the author talks about the excesses of Marxism, and then he says, those are huge, but the excesses of capitalism are just as bad. Nevertheless, we cannot blame Marx for the abuses of capitalism. The truth is that Marx was no more responsible for the monstrous oppression of the communist world than Jesus was responsible for the Inquisition. And while that may be true, while it is true that perhaps not everything that Cuba did is exactly what Marx imagined, I still think that, as I said, It was approved by the entire priestdom of Marxism historically, almost unquestionably. And so, for that reason, I continue to believe that we're still in a Marxist country. They now use the term socialist, but socialism did not, in many countries, go as far in banning private property and on the private sector to the extent that Cuba did. All right, so here's an example of the Cuban Revolution at work. Here is a list of the labor sector of Cuba, the type of employment that Cuba had prior to the revolution, say 1954, 2 years after Batista's second administration in Cuba. And what you see is that it looked like a normal economy where you have private sector workers and public and self-employed, and then you had the public sector was 8.8. So essentially, it was a private-oriented economy. By 1970, most employees became state-owned. The private sector essentially disappeared. Self-employed disappeared. You only had an odd category. So the Cuban Revolution very quickly moved in the direction of abolishing private employment because it abolished the private sector. By 1968, almost the entire retail sector was nationalized. You can still go to Cuba today, and you're going to be surprised to find that there's very little private retail, almost none. Everything is still state-owned to this day. You can see, for example, in 2001, you continue to have the majority of workers working for the public sector, and you see a little bit of an expansion of the private sector, but that is actually a smaller number today because they started to do a crackdown on this sector in the 2000s. So again, my point is, you may want to call it socialism. I still want to call it Marxist because it is very radical in how it deals with the private sector. Let me also show another indicator of the lack of private activity in Cuba. This is private investment as a percent of GDP. It has Cuba here, and we only have data for 2000, and 4.2 of the total economy is in private hands. This is a small number relative to even Vietnam, China with 17, Nicaragua 19, and other Latin American countries. It also had a large component of soldiers, but I don't want to get into it. I just want to emphasize the idea that they're still not opening the country to the private sector. All right, let me now talk about the paradox. The paradox is the following. How come a revolution that was so Marxist in its treatment of the private sector and its desire to establish a dictatorship of the proletariat come about? And what I want to argue is that, interestingly, Marx, in so many ways, the intellectual inspiration of many of these policies, cannot easily explain this outcome. In other words, a lot of the possible explanations for what happened in Cuba are difficult to generate on the basis of Marxist theory of revolution. Let me then say a little bit about Marxist theory. And again, an incredibly creative thinker, perhaps one of the most influential thinker of the 19th century, and certainly one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century. No, I'm not going to do justice, but for the sake of our discussion, some very basic Marxist politics 101. For Marx, the fundamental problem of capitalism is the issue of inequality. Marx is absolutely impressed with how much the owners of the private means of production generate so much wealth on the one hand with an extraordinary amount of poverty or deprivation or exploitation on the other hand. It's the simultaneous expansion of wealth for some and deprivation for the majority, what for Marx is remarkable about the Industrial Revolution, but also incredibly objectionable. Marx believed that capitalism cannot reform itself, that there is a conflict of interest between the owners of wealth and everybody else, so that the owners of wealth will never accept piecemeal reform, because significant reform of empowering the have-nots involve a type of distribution that the folks that have wealth wouldn't tolerate. So Marx says the good news is that this rise in inequality is unsustainable. At one point, the deprived masses will not take it anymore. They will have the numbers and the anger and the vision, and they are going to rebel violently. So in Marx's theory of revolution, the notion is that you need to have a lot of inequality where you have advanced levels of capitalism, but the have-nots in this system of inequality are the ones who are going to overthrow the existing regime and the capitalist society and eventually eliminate private property. And sure enough, a lot of what happened in Cuba could be explained on the basis of this argument. And this is kind of how the argument goes for Cuba. The Marxist argument goes like this. Essentially, Cuba was a prosperous sugar mill. All it did in the international economy was essentially to sell sugar abroad. This produced enormous wealth for the landowners, for the state, and even permitted Havana to become one of the wealthiest cities in Latin America in the 1940s and 50s. But fundamentally, a sugar plantation economy is the quintessential description of exploitation. All you have to do, how many of you have spent time cutting cane at some point? I know that's some, right. You have done some. Well, you know, it's incredibly brutal because what you have to do when you're cutting cane, first of all, the place is kind of hot, and you have to do it in a very short amount of time, but you have to cut the cane twice. You first have to cut it once, and then you have to kneel and cut it from below, and you have to do that the whole day under the sun. No wonder they needed to use slaves in the 19th century to do this. But essentially, even though there was abolition of slavery, because Cuba never abolished this sugar economy in the 1950s, it maintained pseudo-slavery because the entire countryside was absolutely exploited as a result of this economy, and that this was all that Cuba could produce. Now, the second aspect of this is, of course, the idea that the United States was an important actor in this sugar mill. And the way that the United States played a role was through an incredibly interesting system. It was a system established in 1934 as a result of an act of Congress called Jones-Costigan Act. And this is what the deal was. The United States committed to buying as much sugar as possible from Cuba at a great deal, at a great, great price. And Cubans said, this is awesome. Yes, where do I sign? The United States said, but you have to allow American imports to enter duty-free. And Cubans said, great, because we need the imports and we have plenty of sugar. We'll give you the sugar at a good market rate, and then we will buy American imports. And so the consequence of this sweet deal was that Cuba had no incentives to diversify. Cuba had no incentive to generate an alternative economic activity precisely because the business deal was so good. And eventually, politically, the country became nothing other than a dictatorship that would try to keep this sugar mill in place. And over time, in a Marxist interpretation, you find that the countryside begins to rebel. And sure enough, a young Havana, originally from the countryside, Fidel Castro moves to Havana as a student, and he says, I got to fight Batista. And what he does is, follows not explicitly, but definitely in principle, the idea that you have to go to the countryside to start a rebellion. He moved to Oriente, the easternmost part of the country, and from there he launched a revolution that was widely popular in the countryside and soon enough in the city. And this revolution defeated the regime in place and once the regime in place was expelled, it was possible then to introduce these Marxist policies. All right, so again, too much of a simplification, and I apologize for that, but a lot of the evidence fits this argument. But here's the problem. Here's the problem with the argument. First, let's look at this slide. One of the most interesting things about Cuba prior to the revolution is that the economic presence of the United States is in decline relative to the rest of Latin America. I had other tables, but this is one that we're going to have to rely on. This is the book value of U.S. direct investments in Latin America. And what I want you to notice is not the actual numbers, but the trend. By 1929, Cuba was probably one of the biggest recipients of U.S. investment, but over the years prior to the revolution, what you see is a major decline. The only other country that had this decline was Mexico. Cuba is often thought of as a semi-colony of the United States, but in reality, it was the least colonized if you think that being under the influence of a lot of American investment is a form of proxy colonialism. So that's problem number one. Problem number two, most people who study the Cuban Revolution have noticed that, yes, Fidel Castro mobilized the Cubans from the countryside, but most of the fighting, most of the political upheaval, most of the attacks on the existing regime was done by folks in Havana, mostly by young university students who were sons and daughters of the middle classes and even the wealthier classes, that Batista, by the end of his term, was repudiated by all professional chambers, by the church, by sort of like the entire status quo, the establishment turned so decisively against Batista. And that this is a mystery. The mystery is that the revolution was done not necessarily by the losers in this sugar mill system that existed, but in so many ways by the winners. The winners were living in Havana. It included the rising middle classes and a great number of professionals. If I had my other notes here, I would have inundated you, flooded you with data on, number one, how wealthy Havana citizens were in the 1950s, to the point that folks in Latin America called Havana the Paris of the Americas, how large the middle class was, and how politicized the professional and the middle classes were in the fight against Batista. They didn't fight Batista right away. Batista comes into office in 1952, but by 1954, the political situation in Cuba is troublesome for Batista. The entire Havana and the rest of the country is actively conspiring, actively fighting what they thought was going to be a democratic revolution, not a Marxist revolution. So this creates a problem. And in so many ways, it is opens the possibility of perhaps another theory for regime change. Let's just focus only on regime change. And I want to talk about this in the context of what's happening in North Africa. One could imagine that the Cuban Revolution would have been a moment in which an old dictatorship, the Batista regime, would be overthrown to be replaced by a democracy. This happens a lot. It's not exactly what happened in Cuba, because instead, as I mentioned in the beginning, you get the implementation of a Marxist system. But most people who were fighting in the 1950s wanted a transition to democracy, wanted to establish the return of democracy, the return of the 1940 Constitution, to be more precise. And given that a theory based on Marxist dialectic materialism and positing that the clash of classes produces the forces necessary for real revolution, given that that argument doesn't work so well, it cannot explain the revolutionary coalition, essentially. It cannot explain why so many elites and middle-income folks who were part of this coalition. Is the theory wrong? Well, maybe the theory is wrong, and what other political scientists have done is to then generate an alternative argument, not just for the Cuban Revolution, but argument for how do you get changes away from autocracy. And sure enough, there is an argument that says, well, real regime change occurs not under conditions of high levels of inequality, high levels of poverty, high levels of deprivation, but rather in prosperous societies. Societies that are achieving rapid economic development, societies that transform themselves incredibly quickly. And it's done by the winners. The new winners are the ones who are going to find the status quo unacceptable when the status quo is a dictatorship. Now, that theory, which comes to us as a result of Sam Huntington, who was a Harvard political science professor, works great to explain Cuba's revolutionary coalition. But it has the problem that it cannot explain why, after going through all that trouble of carrying out a revolution, the outcome is a Marxist revolution. Why is it that instead of democracy, you end up with a regime that was very popular and incredibly non-liberal and incredibly radical in its approach to capitalism? Something that nobody would have imagined. Nobody would have imagined that this is going to be the outcome. Now, here's where theories stop short. This continues to be one of the biggest mysteries in the study of the Cuban Revolution. On the one hand, it is not exactly done by the protagonists in a Marxist mythology of revolution. It is actually done precisely by winners of the system, and yet it is in this country that you get such a radical revolution. Now, if you go to Miami, and you talk to Cubans who have left Cuba, they will all give you all kinds of theories to fill in the gap. From the revolution was betrayed by a small elite, basically the Castro brothers with Che Guevara, who were outliers in the ideological spectrum. They would say it was because of the enormous amount of repression. They would say it only happened because there was a Soviet Union willing to essentially take over from the United States. The Soviet Union told Castro early on, within a year of the revolution, worry not about your sugar, I will buy your sugar if the Americans decide to impose an embargo on you. And not only that, not only will I give you a great deal, but I will send oil to you. So I'm going to pay back with oil, and I'm going to send you so much oil that you're going to be able to have enough left to export it so that you can generate dollars from it. So this deal was the most amazing deal that Cuba could have ever imagined, and it was offered to Fidel Castro in February. And a lot of people say at that point he said, I now have permission to become a radical Marxist and not suffer the consequences of an American counterattack. So all kinds of theories, but it is an interesting paradox in the social sciences, and this combination of modernization happening simultaneously with a radical revolution. Why might this be relevant to events in North Africa? If you look at the places where we're seeing a lot of the unrest, you can almost see basically the same phenomenon. Many of these uprisings are occurring on the part of students, and students are always a sign of modernization. Students at the university level are kids who don't need to work and therefore cannot come from very poor background. They were supported by in Egypt, for example, there is plenty of evidence to show that it was the most modernized sectors of society that pushed the status quo away. But it also tells you that you cannot exactly predict what's going to happen once you get rid of the status quo. Are you going to get a liberal, democratic, moderate system, or are you going to get forms of ideological extremism? For the times, of course, communism was the ideology that was appealing in Latin America to justify dictatorships. But nowadays in the Middle East, we know that there are many other ideologies to justify closures of the political system. And one of the things that I want you to walk away with from this talk is that while the most modernizing and seemingly democratic forces of a country may bring democracy to you, a lot can happen once you get rid of the status quo, whereas the protagonists change and the power can be transferred to the more radical elements. Now, this is what happened in Cuba, and it happened with a lot of repression, but also with a lot of cheering. There is no question that as Fidel Castro announced more and more radical steps, no elections, complete nationalization, let's get rid of the Catholic Church, let's kill everybody who is against this regime, he had more and more and more crowds cheering. We never know whether it was a majority, because there was never a free election. There has never been a free election under Fidel Castro. But we do know that there were plenty of supporters, and that's the point, is that a revolution that can be this radical and can be so pleasing to so many folks once you get started. So that is the first part of what I wanted to suggest, and to essentially conclude with this part by saying that in many ways, the study of the origins of the Cuban Revolution, I hope you never consider it a settled matter. The theories for it don't work entirely, and it's, if anyone wants to do more research and theory development, Cuba would be a good case. All right, now, what happened to Cuba now that you get the Castro brothers, or for many years, actually, it was just one brother in charge. But this is a chart that shows levels of development. And I have several countries here, several, and it goes from 19, I know it's very small print, I apologize for that, but I'll try to tell you what this shows. This is levels of GDP per capita ranging from 1950 to about 1998, based on the work done by an economic historian who's not a Latin Americanist. He does this for many countries. And what do we have here? First, this line represents Latin America and the Caribbean average from 1950. And what you see is an improvement over time, a little bit of trouble here, flat growth, and a little bit of a recovery towards the end of the 1990s. And here is Cuba in comparison to its regional peers. It does fairly well in 1950. In fact, it is far above the norm for Latin America and the Caribbean. The only other country was perhaps Argentina and maybe Venezuela, an oil-rich country. But almost everybody else is behind Cuba in terms of levels of wealth. But what you have is this gradual downward trend to the present. And now the gap with the rest of Latin America is enormous. And here's Chile, for example. Chile, it's this line. Here you see Chile. It had a little bit of a lot of trouble in the 80s. And twice actually under Pinochet. But since the transition to democracy, Chile has taken off. And this is now the star of Latin America in terms of economic performance. And Cuba is just so quiet and so behind using this indicator. Here, by the way, we have China. China incredibly poor compared to Latin America, compared to everybody else. But you see this turnaround in China's development, and by 1998, it was already rising and surpassing Cuba. So, in many ways, Cuba is an interesting case because, on the one hand, it has low levels of economic growth, and on the other hand, it has an enormously equitable society. Again, how this was accomplished is a complicated matter, and whether it was necessary or not. But for most of the Cuban Revolution, Cuba was a little bit of an outlier compared to other regions of the world because it was producing a fair degree of equity at home with very low economic growth. And compared to Latin America in the 1980s, which had low growth, but it was very unequal, or compared to East Asia, which has a lot of growth with equality, or Latin America prior to the 1980s, which produced high growth with inequality. So in some ways, Cubans felt like, all right, we may not be growing that much, but we have equality. And essentially, this was seen as the quintessential primordial goal, and therefore don't criticize us because we may not be generating huge prosperity, but we are eliminating the most abject conditions of poverty in the country. Now, what happened is that after 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba entered into a very serious recession. And this has been as brutal as the Great Depression in the United States, and a lot of the equity gains in Cuba have disappeared, and now most folks discuss that Cuba has become very Latin American. It has moved to this cell here, where you now have inequality and yet very low levels of growth at this point since the end of the Cuban Revolution. Let me show you one more chart that I think summarizes why Cuba is so polemical in development studies. This is a chart that plots the average education level of the average years of schooling of countries' workforce. You can calculate what is the average number of school years that the average worker in your economy has. And it ranges from 1 year of schooling, or 0, all the way to 13 years of schooling as an average. So these are the most educated countries, and these are the countries with low levels of education. And here you see growth rates going from 1950 to 1998. And sure enough, the trend line is non-controversial. It's exactly what you expect. The countries that grew the most in the Cold War and up until the late 1990s had high levels of schooling. Maybe growth gave you the schooling, maybe the schooling gave you the growth. That's a big debate, but the truth is that they are correlated. Where is Cuba here? This is Cuba. Cuba has negative levels of growth. We saw this in a long period of time, but incredibly high levels of schooling. It is almost, the average is 9 years. The average worker in Cuba has 9 years. So few countries are here. Most of them are very wealthy countries. Now, if you are the defender, an advocate of the revolution, you would feel nothing other than enormous pride in this. Because for you, this is a sign that you're able to take care of something, such a fundamental right of humans like education, with very little resources. It can be done. It is in some ways the justification for some of the more draconian measures that the regime instituted. If you're a critic of the revolution, what you would probably say here is, this tells you how oppressive the regime is. It is a regime that has the best asset that any economy can have, a highly schooled society with no performance. Something about this regime is killing the drive in this population. And if you were to eliminate some of these Marxist characteristics, you would see a huge takeoff. And certainly you would expect Cuba to be here where the trend line is, and you don't. This is currently the debate in Cuba. Nobody wants to compromise this position of high levels of schooling, good levels of health, but the question is, what does Cuba need to do in order to generate more prosperity, generate growth, try to join the rest of nations that basically since the late 1990s are in some kind of an upward trend. Defenders of the revolution say we cannot dismantle the Marxist institutions that brought us here. Critics, of course, saying those are precisely the institutions that you have to get rid quickly, immediately, and irrevocably. In many ways, one of the things that has happened in Cuba is that Cuba now has had almost 50 years telling everyone, its citizens, its students, its friends, its enemies, that being socialist, that being Marxist is good for you. But the truth of the matter is that if you go to Cuba now, you will see a level of scarcity that is hard to imagine. There is no major sources of wealth, private wealth, but you also have quite a bit of scarcity. This is a picture for a grocery store in Cuba. There's nothing. I just got back from Cuba, and here's another one. This picture I took, this is mine. I went into this country, and it has a few little products here, but the rest of the shelves are empty. And this is like so odd. You never see this anywhere. It's a state-owned company. You could go to some state-run retail shops where you buy things with dollars or with convertible currency and you find products there. But this is absolutely dismal for the region. That it's a question of a degree of scarcity that most Cubans could afford a lot of stuff if they were available. But they're not available, and so there is very little consumption. One of the reasons why, if you guys decide to Cuba, you will notice that this country is very clean. There's no trash, because there's very little consumption. You go to the beaches, and they're super clean. The streets are relatively okay, because there's no trash. But that's because there is very little consumption. By the way, I was asked to tell you that the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities is organizing a series of trips to Cuba. I went with them, and it's a great trip. If you're interested, I can put you in contact. They've done 2 this year, and they plan to do a few more this year. And the price is okay. It's not too high. And it's a great company. It's a group of 21 of folks like you interested in the humanities, smart, interested in serious tourism rather than just going to the beaches. And it's a great trip. And if you're interested, I don't know if such trips are easy to book here in Vermont, but if the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities is organizing some of these trips. This is just another picture of public transportation, private transportation in Cuba. Cuba is, most people are impressed that you see all these American cars from the 1950s, but the most frequent sight in Cuba is actually people riding their bikes everywhere, and this is a sign of this notion of low economic growth. All right, let me skip this and talk about the system responding, and this is going to be my last set of remarks. As you may know, Fidel Castro, because of an illness, had to resign his post as Commander-in-Chief and President of the Republic and all these other titles, and power was transferred to his brother, who is pretty old as well. And he's been in office now for 3 years or so, 4 years. And just last year, right around the fall, the government announced a series of reforms to address this problem of low economic growth and low levels of productivity and scarcity. And I think this weekend, there's going to be a major Congress of the Communist Party to discuss these reforms. The reforms are very top-bottom. They were generated by the top leadership, and now they want to have discussions of this policy in the Communist Party. And what are the things that they're going to do? Well, they're going to fire 10% of the public sector. They're going to let them go. Unusual for Cuba, because Cuba has always tried to provide employment, underpaid and underperforming, but employment nonetheless to most Cubans. Now they're going to fire 10% of workers. They're going to allow self-employment in 178 activities, such as being a plumber or running your own restaurant or doing small service jobs. You're going to allow private restaurants, you're going to allow them to have more tables. The reason why this is important is because if you allow more tables, you essentially are giving them permission to hire workers. In Cuba, private restaurants can function, but with a limit on 10, 12 tables, with the idea that you would only hire your close relatives. But by now having larger restaurants, you're going to have to go outside of your family and you're going to have to hire. So it's the beginning of firms, because there's going to be private contracting of employees. You're going to allow people to rent their rooms. If you have a house and you want to offer one room for rentals, you can do that. This was banned in Cuba. People did it all the time, but it was under the table. Now it's going to be allowed. This is one of the most interesting reforms. People like me, Cubans living abroad, I'm Cuban American, are going to be able to send money to Cuba to finance restaurants and the self-employed. Remittances were allowed, but you were never allowed to use remittances to start your own little business. Now that's going to be possible. And there's going to be a new tax system, and in total the government expects to authorize 250,000 new businesses. Here's the problem. Definitely a major reform for a system that has always been so proud of its fight against capitalism. But nobody really is convinced that this is actually a serious market-oriented reforms, because you are not establishing a contract-based society. You are not creating credit, for example, so people are not going to be able to borrow money. You're not going to have an independent judiciary, so that if you provide a service and you have a dispute with the different parties to your contract, there's no mechanism for addressing this. So you're going to have, in some ways, too modest of an institutional change, that you're probably going to generate a bazaar economy where what you have is people selling stuff, but you're not going to have what you really need, or what the enemies of the revolution advocate, which is the return of real private property, real property rights. This is not part of the equation. The equation is you can have private profit and a little bit of private employment, period. The big debate is this going to be enough to bring Cuba out of its economic stagnation, or on the contrary, will it simply keep Cuba stagnant and yet make it even more unequal? In other words, some folks saying that this type of minimal reform will not solve the bigger problem of Cuba of economic contraction over decades, and exacerbate the problem of inequality, which at least was something that the revolution at some point managed to achieve. These are hot topics in Cuba. Just two more points to conclude, and then I'll be more than happy to hear your reactions. Basically, what I try to tell you is that we have a paradox of a very Marxist revolution in terms of its outputs that doesn't conform with a Marxist theory on the origins of revolution, but one could nonetheless argue that while Marx cannot explain the origins, Marxism could probably explain why the revolution has stagnated. The bans on what essentially are freedoms of association is very strong in Cuba, and in many ways explains why Cuba is such an impoverished, though not a highly unequal society. Those are my remarks. Why don't I stop there? Let me see. Yes. Thank you very much for your attention, and now I'll be more than happy to take questions. Thank you. Yes.
I feel obliged to make the point that a lot of people in this country think that Marxism and socialism are synonymous, and they aren't, because examples of socialism can be found in the ancient world. In fact, before Marx was born in Europe, there was Christian socialism that was very popular there. So, what I'm thinking is, had the sugar plantations been reorganized as democratic cooperatives, that would have been equally socialist, but not the Marxist fascist variety. A lot of us think that what has come about as Marxism as equally fascist.
Yes, I mean, I totally agree that you have an extreme version of socialism with Marxism. And although we like to think that in the ideological spectrum, here's the extreme right, and here's the extreme left, I totally agree that the extremes are closer to each other than they are to what is a more moderate position. A social democrat is so far away from a radical Marxist and so far away from a fascist or market fundamentalist. They are closer to each other because in so many ways these are ideologies that rely significantly on excessive degrees of coercion. And this is what makes these seemingly polar opposite positions actually be more convergent than otherwise. So I agree. In Cuba, your point about you could have done a lot of these changes without abolishing political freedoms and without creating such a totalitarian state. I agree. I think that that's true. The problem is that once you introduce political competition, you need to contemplate the possibility that the existing leadership will have to be replaced or rotated out of office somehow. And when Cubans say that we need to defend the revolution, they actually mean we need to defend the leaders who brought this great system for you. And this produces a mentality of we don't want to take any chances by opening up the political system to real political competition to this day. So I totally agree that, and that is why I started by saying this is Marxism and not exactly socialism, because this combination of autocracy with such a draconian ban on private property is too extreme. Yes, who wrote poems and short stories and was also a reporter. And he joins the cause for Cuba's independence from Spain early on, but he's a writer and intellectual, and he tries to write, and he faces difficulties at home, and he moves to the United States, and he spends a lot of time in New York. And while in New York, he, of course, did a lot of writing that was cultural, but also political. He complained a lot about Spanish rule in Cuba. He discussed a lot the necessity to liberate Cuba. But he also spent a lot of time criticizing the United States, criticizing the most inhumane aspects of life in New York City or in a country that is industrializing as rapidly. And so he had a long list of things to say about the United States. So José Martí is your typical 19th century anti-American intellectual. He's very comfortable living in the United States, but he sees the ugly side of the United States and he writes a lot about it. So that the Cuban Revolution, in order to justify some of these anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist excesses, had no trouble drawing from José Martí's writings and cultural production. Just as the enemies of the revolution do with José Martí. When I go to Miami and I'm with the Cuban opposition, it's José Martí, let's read more José Martí and José Martí. So you can do with him everything, both defend a liberal democratic system, but also defend this version. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba dropped the term Marxist-Leninism, and they began to emphasize more the Martí-based legacy as something that the revolution is actually trying to protect into perpetuity. So now Martí is even bigger. When you go to Cuba, I hope you get a chance to go. Has anybody been to Cuba? I think oh, okay. Well, if you went recently, you will see in front of what is the U.S. interest section. It's a big building right by the Malecón. Right after the Elian Gonzalez incident at the end of the Clinton administration, when there was this dispute about the custody for this kid whose mother drowned crossing the Strait of Florida, he was sent back to Cuba, and Fidel Castro, in front of the U.S. interest section, created a monument to José Martí holding a kid who was Elian Gonzalez and pointing at the Americans, and this is in a square that is now called La Tribuna Anti-Imperialista, the anti-imperialist tribune, and there's an enormous cult now for Jose Marti. Fortunately, the Cuban currency hasn't been changed to Martis. Some people have talked about doing that, but they haven't gone that far. It's still called a peso. But there's a lot of infatuation, and there's no question that he is one of the most brilliant. He is the equivalent of a founding father for Cuba, as there can be one. Yeah.
I have to say I agree with your political conclusions that you've come to. It's absolutely true that it became a dictatorial regime after the revolution. I disagree somewhat with your economic conclusions. A lot of your figures come from the World Bank. I mean, you could be working for Paul Wolfowitz to a certain extent by saying, well, I'm looking at these figures that show economic growth, and those are the metric by which we're judging a country and their ability to change. I have some Cuban friends who went to Haiti after the earthquake last year, and they were just completely shocked at the levels of poverty in their closest neighbor. And I wonder what your thought is, rather than comparing Cuba with a South American country which has, the World Bank has forced them to extract their natural resources. Cuba and the other Caribbean islands don't have much in the way of natural resources to extract. How has Cuba done relative to Jamaica, Haiti, even the Dominican Republic, as far as economic equity and expansion go?
Although some of the figures do come from the World Bank, and Cuba is not a member of the World Bank. Many of the figures that are used come from other sources. Some of the figures, the schooling figures, come from the United Nations. Cuba is a member of the United Nations, or from this economist, independent economist who has passed away in Madison. But I will take your point and say that there's so much cloudiness when it comes to statistics in general, and especially Cuban economic data, that we shouldn't read too much into them. That much I agree, that there is, that we may not want to necessarily be so reliant on those figures, and that other figures might give you very different stories. All right. But I don't think that there would be anybody who would necessarily argue that Cuba is richer today than it was prior to the revolution. Richer in terms of more prosperity. All right, leaving that aside, what is the economic future of Cuba? Look, this is a big problem for the entire Caribbean. These are, in today's development, there is the mantra that small economies need to develop some kind of an export niche of some sort. What the Caribbean has done is to generate the export of tourism, which is a form of export. And for small economies, that is a source of a lot of wealth. Cuba has begun to move in this direction. This is part of the opening of the 1990s. It was very open to tourism prior to the revolution. It shut itself down to capitalist tourism, and it opened itself up to socialist tourism. But in the 1990s, it opened itself up for tourism. But most folks agree that you want Cuba's future to rely on something else. And is there a possibility here? The optimistic view is the levels of schooling. Human capital in Cuba is so impressive for world standards, not just Caribbean or Latin American standards, that all you need is a slight change and this country will take off. But there are folks who argue that human capital is kind of like good food. You need more than just good food. You need to be able to have the best environment and the right institutions. And it's not clear that Cuba is going to be able to quickly generate the incentives for this entrepreneurship and level of schooling to produce the kind of wealth generation that you want to see. Cuba could easily become, and here I'm going to sound incredibly conservative, a la Communist Party of the Cuban government, of the Cuban Republic. It would be very easy for Cuba to become something like what's happening to the north of Mexico, a base for the transshipment of drugs. One good thing about the Cuban Revolution is that it has kind of saved Cuba from it becoming a major bridge or trampoline of drugs coming from the Andes into the United States. And I would imagine that the moment that you ease things up in Cuba and you lift some of the political and economic restrictions, you're going to see an immediate jump of narco trafficking happening in Cuba. And this is horrible. This is the worst thing that could happen. And who knows whether Cuba could survive it. But one needs to worry a lot about the future of Cuba or any Caribbean nation. Do they have anything other than tourism? Who knows? The Central American nations have moved away from agriculture and have started to do textile exporting in Central America. This generates a little bit of wealth, but it's not exactly that sustainable in the long run, and so one would have to worry about the economy. There's a sticker that was very popular in Miami, a bumper sticker that said, "No Castro, no problem." And I was like, that is such the opposite of the philosophy. You know, once you get rid of the Castro communist ideology, you're going to then have a host of problems that this country has never had to deal with. And who knows if it'll be equipped to address them. So I worry about that. Yes?
In terms of talking about the theory of revolution, you were saying that income inequality is what leads to revolution. And certainly in the United States, our income inequality has increased astronomically over the past 30 or 40 years. And there's a proposal to give more tax cuts to the rich and cut income from the poor. Any concern about that in terms of here?
Since Marx, social scientists of all stripes have debated how terrible inequality is. Some folks arguing that it's not only the worst violation of human rights, but it's also politically explosive. But there are many scholars who don't agree necessarily with that judgment, who do not necessarily agree that it is the worst form of human right violation imaginable, or that it is politically explosive. In other words, that it's going to generate political unrest. You're absolutely right that most experts agree that the United States is seeing quite a bit of inequality. And there are two ways of generating inequality. You can have inequality that is called sort of like a lateral Y, letter Y. The rich people go up and the poor people go down, and you have a lot of inequality toward the end. But you can have inequality that is the rich people go up a lot and the low levels go up but not at the same rate. And many folks argue that that is not necessarily such a horrendous outcome relative to others, because the reason they don't think it's that horrendous is because people believe, some folks believe, that many of the policies that are typically deployed to address inequality are very dangerous. Huge distribution drives are probably more explosive politically than persistent inequality. So it is, to this day, one of the hottest debates in the social sciences. Leaving aside the question of, are we more unequal? Most people agree that the United States definitely is today, more so than 20 years ago. Is this that bad, or is this that dangerous politically? Or at least would it be more dangerous instead to engage in high levels of taxation in order to distribute? This is the debate. And, it's part of what's happening in Capitol Hill at the moment, and so I don't want to get into it, but we do have two parties that have incredibly different philosophical views about this. Every time I am told that in this country parties are all alike, I am like, what country do you live in? We have two parties that have a fundamental disagreement about this issue of inequality in the country and the use of taxes to address inequality.
I think your presentation said when the revolution occurred, there was equality.
No.
And then you didn't say...
There was quite a bit of inequality, but you also had quite a bit of prosperity in Cuba in the 1950s.
For some.
Yes, as is always true, yeah, that there is inequality, but you also have new winners that didn't exist before, the rise of middle classes and new sources of wealth. Yes?
No, well, then I misunderstood you.
I-
Because I thought you said there was equality, and then later on, there was less equality. And I wanted you to elaborate on
I see. I did say that by the 1970s, the country, Cuba, the Cuban government, achieved a significant degree of inequality, measured in terms of how much do the elites have relative to the poor. That is absolutely true by the 1970s and into the 80s. It goes away with the recession that is triggered by the collapse of the Soviet Union and the impact that that had in Cuba. You now have a lot of inequality in Cuba, mostly because most people who have access to dollars, either because you work in the tourism industry, or because you have friends or relatives in Miami and you receive remittances, or because you do something illegal, and there is a lot of illegal activity. Basically, the illegality in Cuba is you steal from your job toilet paper, for example, and then you sell it to your neighbors, and they pay you with dollars that they get from Miami or from tips in the tourist sector. People who are privileged enough to be engaged in those activities now have a little bit more wealth than the rest, and so that's why now we have a much more unequal society in Cuba than in the 70s and 80s.
I was curious to know what portion of the Cuban middle class fled the revolution, and how many of them are hanging around Miami waiting to get their property restored?
The initial wave of defections, say for example 1959, the first 6 months, were Batistianos, supporters of the Batista regime. But every other wave since then has been comprised of people who defended the revolution at some point. If you didn't leave in the very beginning, it's because you felt attached to the political struggle, and almost everybody else has been a defector or in the sense of being disaffected by it. The entire middle class did leave, but many other folks who were not in the middle classes. Some estimates mention the fact that at least 10% of Cuba's population has left over the years. Cuba has one of the highest rates of emigration, of departure in the world for a country that is not ravaged by war. So, and many of these waves from the 1990s and the 2000s are not middle-class folks because they are sons and daughters of the revolution, and they now comprise the bulk of Miami. The supporters of the status quo in the 1950s are very old, very dead, very sick, and it's a dying breed. And it's one of the reasons why today Miami is much more diverse ideologically. For example, the question of whether, I just realized that I have been talking about Cuba for more than an hour, I believe, and I haven't mentioned the word embargo. Remarkable for this topic, but here it is. The embargo is now very polemical in Miami, with many Cubans completely opposed to the embargo. Cuban Americans who are completely opposed to the embargo. I don't think that Cubans in Miami want to go back to Cuba to reclaim property. I think most Cubans recognize that the country is in such a decrepit state that what they want to be able to do is to go and invest and generate new wealth and start new businesses and develop the country rather than to take things back. Cubans in Cuba probably think that the Miami community wants to take possession back of what they left behind. And this is something that the Cuban government openly discusses when they discuss Miami. But I don't think that the question is, let me take what I had back. However, it is true that the law of the United States, the law of the embargo, the Helms-Burton bill, discusses the fact that there needs to be restitution, and this is a terrible problem politically because it makes the Cuban opposition look as if all they want is to be compensated, and that is not exactly what Cubans in Miami, in my opinion, want. What they want is the elimination of the second embargo, the embargo that the Cuban government imposes on Cubans. But that's my personal appreciation of what's happening in Miami. Yes, sir.
Ask if you thought that the Marxist theory of regime change or revolution has been maybe just repudiated completely because of, I think, your point that the winners, by and large, you not only in Cuba, but you could look at other revolutions in the late 19th century through the 20th century, seem to be as much driven by middle-class elites in a context of great inequality, of middle-class elites and intellectuals as, I don't know, I'm wondering if that's my hunch.
This is the problem. We cannot be that absolute because of what you're saying. On the one hand, many of these impressive political transformation, all these springs that we're seeing from Iran to and now in North Africa, are actively led by winners in every sense of the word, but in the context of inequality. So you have both conditions coexisting, and so you don't have enough evidence to say that inequality is not doing the trick. Having said that, most of the current theorists are very much not Marxist anymore when they study this. They among experts on, new experts of revolutions and big regime change, they actually, some folks have even gone as far as to say that elites, in order to be able to justify their rebellion, exaggerate the extent to which there are social injustices. In other words, that the idea is that this is something that is done in order to justify what is a struggle among elites, and to say, I am fighting in behalf of, and then you start to name all the injustices that you want to. And this is perhaps the most extreme version of the most anti-Marxist explanation for regime change possible. I think that inequality is very bothersome myself, and I am sure that it is politically explosive, but I agree that it's probably not the most important driver of regime change, that regime change comes on behalf of the winners. It's unfortunate that we don't have theories to predict what the winners are going to do once they displace the existing status quo, but that's a problem for my field, not necessarily for you guys. Yes, back there, yeah.
Thank you for your talk. As I was back here listening to your great talk, I was realizing that on May 1st is the 20th anniversary of me visiting Cuba myself and actually marching in the May Day parade as a guest.
So I guess just a quick comment and a question. I guess the second statement there, the Marxism can explain the revolution's stagnation, and also when I saw the graph that you posted about GDP and such, I would sort of posit that the gains of the revolution, and when I was there, I really did see incredible gains of the revolution as far as lifting all people and flattening out the inequalities that were in existence before, during Batista's reign. That sort of line, that middle line that exhibited the dots everywhere in Cuba was low. That GDP line is more like, well, how many, it seems to me, more how many TVs you can own is up there in the above line. You know, it's more of a prosperity from an American perspective, from a capitalist perspective, and not necessarily from what a lot of us here in Vermont value as sort of a society, health, and wellness perspective. So that's just sort of a comment to those sort of views of GDP and performance data from sort of a capital perspective.
Do you see health and wellness
Yes. I wonder, because you recently visited, you have those pictures. I wonder if you have a comment or an observation on how the general public, most of which I would assume are still generally in support of the ideas of the original revolution in Cuba. Are they positive with the reform ideas? Are they negative? Maybe if you could give an idea of the percentage of breakdown on how people are reacting. And I know as you know, sometimes it's hard to give that a good read in Cuba.
Sure. On the first point, I fully agree that human development cannot be about exclusively material gains. But I think that the reason we worry so much about poverty, which is an indicator of material deprivation, is because everybody agrees that it is better to have assets than not. You may not want to be excessive, but you need to have assets, and you should not be that content with poverty. The problem is, can you also cultivate other things, less tangible aspects? And that is why we worry so much about the health of humans and their cognitive capacity, and that's why we think of education as an alternative to the conventional measurement of possessions, which is GDP or gross national income. So I agree that we want to go beyond material possessions, but I don't exactly agree that material possession is an American taste exclusively. On the question of how the reforms are being received, it's very remarkable. The diehard communists are very afraid, but there are important folks who are part of the establishment who are, for the first time, very hopeful, who tell you that, look, we can have surviving socialism if we make some minor changes, just as Vietnam, just as China, just as so many other countries have done, that this is what's going to save us. So you now have a group that is having a panic attack, and a group that is finally feeling incredibly optimistic about the future within the ranks of the Communist Party. And I was able to hear people express both views exactly in these terms, feeling like, you know, this is it, this is the end, forget it, and some people saying, this is all that is necessary and this is going to be enough to bring the relief that we need and to ensure the survival of the revolution. Some enemies of some opponents, some dissidents are also very optimistic about these reforms. This is some type of, your ability to escape the state is such a wonderful release for many folks. But how many of us are self-employed? This is the big problem. Self-employment sounds great, but it puts people in incredible anxiety. You don't know about your income. You don't know whether you're going to make it the next day. You live under precarious conditions. It's so much easier to have employment in terms of so many other things. So there are many folks who are terrified of being one of the Cubans, that 10% that is going to be laid off. They're absolutely terrified of that. So you see a diversity of views on these reforms that is remarkable, precisely because the reforms themselves are pretty remarkable themselves. Yes, sir.
Could I read just one sentence from a book about Cuba?
Sure.
Comment. In the correspondence between John Kennedy and Khrushchev around the Cuban crisis, there's a reference to a situation that these two states wanted to avoid. It is symbolized by an image of two blind moles who meet in a dark underground passage and get entangled in a life and death struggle. And that's Lloyd de Moss, who's a psychohistorian. His idea. I wonder if you've ever heard of him. I read it in a book, Beyond the Brain by Stanislav Grof, and it's an epilogue in that book. And he talks about how revolutions are a reproduction of the birth trauma, but it's unconscious, it's a mass thing. That's why revolutions are so successful initially, but afterwards they often go astray. So, have you ever?
I am not familiar with those names and that passage. I see. You see. Becoming a political science PhD killed my intellect because I only read political science and Vanity Fair. That's pretty limited, and I always feel that I'm too narrow for someone who's supposedly a scholar. So no, I haven't. I never heard of that.
Any comment you have on the Cuban Missile Crisis and that sort of thing?
Sure. The Cuban Missile Crisis is probably the most significant geopolitical development in the Western Hemisphere from the point of view of U.S.-Latin America relations. The degree to which the Americans became scared of a repetition of a second missile crisis was so massive that it explains a significant degree of American conservatism toward revolutions. Kennedy said it, we want to be on the side of democracy, but I'm now paraphrasing, we want to be on the side of democracy, but we cannot abandon our friendly dictators until we're sure that we're not going to get a Castro. And what was scary about Castro was not the Marxism that he implemented in Cuba, but it was the invitation of the Soviets to establish a military base and with nuclear weapons. This scared Americans like nothing else. And it is perhaps the first time that Americans felt so deeply threatened, ever. Up until this point, up until that point in the Cold War, the Soviet Union had middle-range ballistic missiles. It did not have intercontinental ballistic missiles. So the Soviet Union couldn't really launch a missile attack and hit the United States. With the missile crisis, they could hit any part of the United States, and this was like, and for the Americans to realize that there could be another Cuba that would produce another missile crisis was just too daunting a scenario. And
you meant to say, didn't you, that the Soviets could not reach the U.S. before the Cuban Missile Crisis?
With nuclear missiles, they did not have they soon developed them right after that, but by the time of 1962, here's the situation. NATO, based in Europe, could hit the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc could hit Western Europe, but not the United States, until the missile crisis. So it was like, yes.
Well, that's kind of a segue into what it sounds like the Cuban Missile Crisis was the biggest traumatic event for the United States in terms of national security until 9/11. And they're a little bit comparable in terms of a catastrophic kind of crisis event. But which leads me to ask, now that that's ancient history and the Cold War is long ended, could you talk a little bit about breaking the log jam and you say Miami is more diverse, less homogeneous now, but it's my understanding always been that it's been Miami and the Cuban community down there that has insisted on the adversarial, or at least one of the key players that has insisted on this. Is this going to, is anybody working to change this crazy dynamic in a real way that you see when you read Foreign Affairs or the
Okay. If you were to do an inventory of the different lobbies in the United States interested in lifting the embargo, you would come up with the following list. The tourism industry, the finance industry, the farm lobby from the Midwest, the construction industry, the religious sectors, all religions want to lift the embargo. Everybody that's involved in shipping and in exporting essentially want to lift the embargo. And what you get, essentially, is the Republican Party's electoral coalition. Most of the constituents in the Republican Party are incredibly in favor of lifting the embargo. And the Democratic Party is as well. So your question is incredibly well placed, because why is it that it doesn't change? Now, the veto players are very important, and many folks argue that it's because the organized lobby of Cuban Americans that no president has been eager to change things. This is changing. I don't think that it is the most important explanation. I think the most important explanation has to do with two other factors. Number one, there has never been enough evidence that the Cuban government wants the embargo lifted. It is the official policy, we want the embargo lifted, but there's nothing to suggest that they actually really want it, because they're never able to show any type of concessions. So one way to understand concessions in life is the price that you pay for something that you want. And Cubans are, we're not going to have any, and so there's a theory that says that anytime that there is a type of an opening of sorts, Cuba will do something that will exacerbate the conservative sectors in the United States to become stronger. So that's point number one, that maybe Cuba doesn't want the embargo lifted. It might feel that with the embargo lifted, this would be too much of an avalanche for them to survive. The second factor is, let's look at Vietnam. One of the most remarkable things about the United States is that under the Clinton administration, the United States normalized relations with Vietnam, a country that we went to war against, where there are tons of unaccounted soldiers, and where we have huge bloodshed. And we normalize relations with Vietnam. With Cuba, I don't think a single American soldier has lost his or her life. And there has never been, except a little bit of fighting in Grenada in the early 80s, fire exchange between Cuban troops and American troops, and yet we are paralyzed. So what explains Vietnam? And one of the reasons we get normalization in Vietnam is because, like you say, there were two leaders of the United States that worked strongly for it. It was a bipartisan team, John McCain and John Kerry from Massachusetts and Arizona, both of them Vietnam veterans in the 1990s, doing all the legwork in Vietnam and in their own parties to justify doing something as drastic as normalizing relationship and upsetting many veterans and many Vietnamese Americans who didn't want the United States to normalize relations with Vietnam. For the Cuban cause, there has never been the rise of party leadership to do something as big as McCain and John Kerry did in the 1990s. Maybe if we had veterans of the Spanish-American War still interested in some kind of reconciliation with your former enemies of war, which could be the psychological explanation for why Kerry and McCain were so keen on normalizing relations with Vietnam. But because no American has died, we don't have that psychological drive. So the cause on behalf of lifting the embargo does not have political drive behind it, because we don't have a McCain and a Kerry to do it. And Obama is very scared to offer too many concessions and get nothing in return. So, all right.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. You guys are excellent. Awesome. Thank you.